I'd just like to welcome you all. I'm Barry, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this event, along with Tamsin, who's from the Impact Trust, who's the organization that's actually developing this. Jerry Salol and Tom Lent are also the organizers, and we're welcoming Abby and Ian for a discussion today, and it's a really important, I think, discussion. And you know, the title of the series, "Conversation at the Crossroads," I think couldn't be more apt. We really are at a crossroads in our the future, you know, the future of the world. I think one of the things everybody agrees about is that the world is going to be very different following this really rather tumultuous year. And one of the things that I wrote an article called "Build Back Better" at the beginning of the lockdown. And in it, I talked about the idea of the liman, which is not a word that's in common usage, though you may well have heard of the adjective liminal, which is much more complicated, common. But in a sense, the liman is an anthropological term first used in describing the rites of passage that people go through during puberty and adolescence, and how people leave their childhood without any real sense about where they're going. And Arnold van Gennep, a French anthropologist, wrote this book called The Rites of Passage. And the liman actually destroys our frameworks. It causes feelings of unease and panic. It's scary because all the things that we knew and took for granted are no longer there. And we fear the total collapse of everything we know and hold dear, and people want to go back to the way it was. On the other hand, the liman also contains the source of all potential radical change. The fact that we're going to uproot the system completely is possibly a good news, because piecemeal reform of a system never gets to the roots of the system, no matter how rotten they are. And this time we could maybe do things completely differently. I was very influenced by a book written by two women, Hannah Ward and Jennifer Wild, called Guard the Chaos, where they talk about how the liman opens up new possibilities for humanity. And they talk about the wilderness that we go into. I mean, they cite the Exodus, Moses and the Exodus and the 40 years in the wilderness, and Christ and the 40 days and nights in the wilderness. And they quote W.H. Auden when he says, "The distresses of choice are our chance to be blessed." So maybe some of the things that the kind of progressive thinkers have been interested in doing could come to fruition, which is why we've got two really smart progressive thinkers on the call today, Ian and Abby, and I'll come to them in a minute. And I wanted, though, one of the things that's come really clear, and I think is really a very good sign, is that as a result of this pandemic, people are open about their vulnerabilities, and we are much more sensitive to each other than we were. And it strikes me that one of the things that's happened is that with the Black Lives Matter situation and the notion of George Floyd and his "I can't breathe," Ian has written a really good paper on I can breathe and the importance of breathing. So what we want to do now is, this conversation is going to be different. We want to engage you emotionally, spiritually, philosophically in this conversation. And one of the things that Abby has suggested is that we actually ground ourselves in this conversation. Just take a minute to actually sit where you are, close your eyes. This is compulsory, by the way. Relax and take a deep breath. Each one of you, take a deep breath in. Hold it for a minute and let it go. And I hope you just feel yourself, feel your identity, feel who you are, feel your groundedness as a human being on this earth. It's a privileged place to be, and we need to kind of look after each other and actually help each other to breathe. The other thing I think is really important about this pandemic is that we need to laugh as well as find grounding ourselves in our sense as spiritual beings. We also need to find humor. And one of the things I'm going to say about Abby, she wrote to me and said that when she's wearing masks, one of the things she does is she, behind the mask, she will smile at babies, she'll pull funny faces, and she'll actually do all kinds of things because you can't see her behind her mask. But what I'd like you to do now is actually, and I'm going to count to three, and at the count of three, you've got to pull a funny face. And we'll know whether you're doing it. So pull the funniest face you possibly can, and we will announce the winner at the end of the call. So 1, 2, 3. Oh, some real winners there. Okay, so that's, I hope, just livened us up a little bit, grounded us and given us a sense of absurdity. You know, if you read Camus' novel, The Pest, absurdity is right at the heart of that, and we shouldn't be taking things too seriously around ourselves, although when we get grounded, we really could. So I'm now going to turn over to Abby, who is the architect of this wonderful exercise, to take us away. Abby, over to you.
Thank you, Barry, for the warm introduction and the great exercise. And I'm really delighted to be here. Like many of you joining us today, this is a conversation I've been looking forward to. Before I hand it over to Ian, I want to note that even though humans are not a keystone species, a theme we'll revisit in this conversation, Ian is a keystone person and has made an enormous impact through his work on mental health, ecology, and poetry. He continues to be a voice for the voiceless. Ian, please take it away with your poem. I'm sorry, you're on mute. A phrase I say all the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Abby, and also to you, Barry. As always, before we begin these particular sessions, one just has to say thank you for all the good work which you are all doing, and to let you know that it's a pleasure for me to be joining you today. So thank you very much for having me as a guest. Some in this audience that I know and who go back a long way with me. I won't name them right now, but it's good to be with you all as well. So I want to take up something which Barry said regarding rites of passage and wilderness, and I'm going to start off this presentation with a poem which I wrote in 1998 when I was working with my wife in Botswana. I was doing some training as a wilderness guide, working on a concession up there, and discovering that these wild areas were no different from the consulting room in which I was used to as an analyst and psychiatrist. I began to discover that people who came to these wild areas actually felt better about themselves. And I wondered, for heaven's sakes, surely isn't this work which we are trying to do as therapists in cities, in our consulting rooms? And it's then I realized that this whole concept of wilderness had been reinforced in me from my earliest experience of contact with the wild, as to how vital this is in terms of human sanity, and how incredibly important it is that we take care of what we have and what possibly what we have left. So I wrote this poem, and it's called Wilderness. Have we forgotten that wilderness is not a place, but a pattern of soul? Every bird and beast and tree, the soul maker. Have we forgotten that wilderness is not a place, but a moving feast of stars, of footprints, scales, beginnings? Since when did we become afraid of the night, and that only the bright stars count, or that the moon is not a moon unless it is full? By whose command were the animals, through groping fingers, one for each hand, reduced to the big and the little fire? Have we forgotten that every creature is within us, carried by tides of earthly blood, and that we named them? Have we forgotten that wilderness is not a place, but a season, and that we are in its final hour? So there we are. Over to you, Abby.
Thank you for that poem. And though it may be obvious, what do you hope this poem evokes in all of us today in our relationship to the wilderness?
Abby, sorry, you repeat that question?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing this poem. And you know, in this current moment, what do you hope this poem evokes in us? What do you hope we take away from it?
Well, I think first of all, one looks at the whole field of poetry and why poetry matters. And for me, it's critical today that in terms of facing up to the environmental issues of our time, that there's no getting away from it, that we are desperate for a language. We're desperate for new metaphors that will help us to understand the human connection to a much broader field of nature. And one of the ways of getting this message across is through poetry. There's no getting away from it. Poetry can say things that prose cannot say. One of the lovely things about poetry is that it hits you from behind. It comes at you from behind. And I think one of the important factors of poetry is that a good poem is a poem that when somebody in the audience hears it, knows that that poem has got something to do with them. That is a good poem. That you are saying something which somebody else can relate to. Like, God, I could have written that. This has said, has something to do with me. And so poetry, by the way, is not limited to just the writing of rhyme and verse. It's vital that we have that way of communicating. But it is also an attitude. Poetry is a way of living, to live poetically, to live a life as near as possible, to try, aspire towards living a life that rhymes. It rhymes with the elements. It rhymes with the wind. It rhymes with seasons. It rhymes with the days and the nights. In other words, a sense of ease. Barry speaks about, introduces humor. And there's some beautiful humor which comes through poetry in terms of what we learn about ourselves. I might even share one of those with you in a minute or two. But of course, it's to do with what it means to, in terms of humor, to go lightly. Mm-hmm. Poetry can sometimes just go so lightly, come at you lightly, and yet have such a significant influence. And this is the value that I get out of some of the poetry that I've read, and more especially some of the poets that I know. And by the way, they are in this audience this evening. So I've just given you one poem that I've written. Here's another one. In terms of our relationship to nature, and to ourselves in our daily lives. By the way, it's written by David Wagoner. It's called "Lost in the Forest," and here's a poem which, in fact, addresses something which we all know. We all get lost. We get confused. We're not sure where we're going anymore. We're looking at our relationships, and somehow things are in something of a mess. There's a turmoil. And the question is, what do you do when you are lost in the forest? And David Wagner writes beautifully. He says, stand still, stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you, they are not lost. Remember, wherever you are is also called here, and you must treat it like a powerful stranger. You must ask permission to know it and to be known. Listen. The forest breathes, it whispers, I made this place around you. And if you leave, you may come back again. But here, no two trees are the same to raven, no two branches the same to wren. But if a tree or a branch is lost on you, then you are surely lost. Stand still. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. Let it find you. This is poetry. It comes from the Latin poiesis, which means to create. It comes from the soles of your feet to speak in a voice which rhymes with the elements.
Beautifully said. Thank you. And your poetry has been quite moving, but I also want to speak to your recent article in Ecological and Psychological Perspective on the year 2020, a reflection in the year in which our basic assumptions about our future will be challenged. It was first published by Thrive Global, and we'll provide everyone a link after. But what are key questions you're grappling with at this juncture? And what questions do you hope that we begin to wrestle with during this time?
Well, I think this is something which Barry already touched on in the introduction, Abby. And the questions which we're really asking are sometimes going to be incredibly difficult to answer. Let me just give you an approach to how I'd like to go with this. It really comes from the great book Letters to a Young Poet. This is a Rumi, and Letters to a Young Poet, and he's saying to this young guy who wants to be a poet, he said, look, don't ask questions if you cannot live with the answers. Rather live the questions, and one day perhaps you will live into the answers. So in terms of the questions that we have to ask of ourselves, well, they surely center around the reality of what we've had to endure in 2020 alone. This is going to be a year, which I think you will all agree with me, a year that we will never ever forget. It is a year when, for heaven's sakes, that the entire globe is being held to ransom by a microbe. And when I put the question, the challenging of how we see ourselves in terms of our relationships with nature from now, it's going to be a big question around who in fact is in charge around here. There's this notion of human stewardship, that we need to be stewards of the earth. On the one hand, this sounds sweet. It sounds obvious. On the other hand, it could be highly arrogant. We, in a way, and sometimes we know this, we can hardly look after ourselves, let alone be stewards of the earth. Who and what is in charge around here? Come back to what it means to be held to ransom by a microbe. Suddenly, the world is brought to a standstill. I think, by the way, the questions around this are going to emerge. And one of the big questions is that comes the line, were we ready for this? Is this something which has really come as a surprise? Is this what they call the black swan? This creature that pitches up surprisingly, unannounced, a creature we thought never existed. And now we're having to adjust and adapt to it? Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the timing of the COVID-19 crisis is quite interesting. Why? because there has been growing global uncertainty for years. We have known over the last decade or so that we need to change the way that we go about our daily lives, especially with the significant human consumptive behavior. We knew that something had to give. And somehow, here, the timing is spot on. A virus arrives, which to all intents and purposes, we don't understand, but in other respects, we've got a pretty good handle on it. Why? Because it was coming. Zoonotic diseases via animal spit has been happening for hundreds of years, actually. We know this, but the context, it's this timing that has made us all stop in our tracks. And so part of the writing which I've done in response to this has been to look at the situation as an opportunity, and this is important, to see it not just as a disaster economically, which, by the way, in many respects it has been, but it's the old story. Get ready to see the phoenix come out of this ashes if you are prepared for it. The big question is now, are we prepared to look at ourselves? I come back to my work as an analyst. Is that part of my work is it not only listening to people's stories as they present, it's also helping them to own up to their own contribution towards their suffering. And when you think about it, any breakdown in relationships is never one-sided. It's always the other side. And sometimes the breakdown in a relationship could be for reasons which are not easy to measure, such as naivety, being far too accepting, far too casual, along those kind of lines, some subtle things which make us own up to, wait a minute, I can't go on doing this. So in terms of this, of the global crisis at the moment, I think each of us has to, in our own way, own up to what our own contribution is towards the environmental issues that we're having to face. And if possible, and by the way, this is always going to be the challenge, is going to be to do something about it. So the questions, many questions. The answers, well, I don't know. I will just come right back to, well, that is to the young poet. Live the question. Just live the question. And one day, perhaps, you'll live into the answer.
Thank you. I will continue to ask questions, though we may not come to full answers here. Many of us, probably most of us, won't have the pleasure of sitting on your couch and unmasking ourselves. But if we are to begin to break down the relationships from which we're a part of, how should we begin to think about the relationships to our community and the environment and sort of the future beyond the pandemic?
Okay. Again, Abby, I'm going to ask you to repeat that question.
Sure. I'm happy to simplify it. If I were a patient on your couch, how would you begin to unearth or discuss how I reflect on the relationships I have, the relationships I should repair, both with my community and with the environment?
Okay. Well, let me tell you, that is a question which could take an awful long time to answer, and I'll tell you why. It's because it is individualized. That question, the answer to that question, or put it this way, the approach to answering that question would be unique to you as it would be to anyone. I would just say to you, it is for anybody who needs to have that question put to them, I would see this as an analysis. In other words, a deep look at the significance of identity. Who are you in terms of who you are and in terms of your relationships? So in a nutshell, I'd go as far as to say this, that for people who come to see me, Abby, and by the way, I don't have a couch. It is a one-on-one, face-to-face session that I enjoy. And with COVID-19 at a little bit of a distance, there's good ventilation. We take our masks off, which makes it easier to breathe, of course. But once we get into the therapeutic sessions, remember, this is process. People, we all have a narrative to tell. We have a narrative which begins with a once upon a time. We have a chapter 2 which begins with and then one day. And then, of course, there's that critical chapter number 3, which will be and then. And so what did you do about it? People present to me because of chapter 2. And then one day, something has happened to them. Okay? And you'll hear it. You'll hear the events. You'll hear how their souls have been trodden on in different ways. And during that time, one will slowly get to know the once upon a time. Tell me where you come from. So we get a good feel of where you've been, who your ancestors are, how far back you go, the events in your life which have led to that second chapter, you're there, and then one day. And then, of course, as I just mentioned a little earlier, as one explores that, the then one day clearly involves owning up to your own contributions to your own suffering. However, there's another question which comes into this, is who are you? Who actually are you? Where does the me in you begin and end? Is it confined to your skull? Does it end at your skin? Or does it extend into a far, far broader field of the natural environment and perhaps into the universe itself? So here this question of identity comes up. And why this is important is because without an identity, a deep sense of identity, it's going to be extremely difficult to find your voice. To find a voice that can speak from the depths of you, of who you actually are. And here comes what I would suggest as a useful way, perhaps, for understanding identity. Here it is, that who you are, who I am, is impossible to define outside of my relationships. There is no such thing as the rugged individual, okay? Who you are, who I am, is impossible to define outside of my relationships. And by the way, not just human to human. These are to the animals in our lives. These are to the mountains, to the rivers. These are to the forests in our lives, the geographies of our childhood. They shape us, and we in turn shape them. Identity is always something dynamic. It is always new. It's always somehow unfolding, little by little. And I think if we attune ourselves to a dynamic sense of identity that is not isolated to the skull and to the skin, it allows us with a far greater sense of gratitude to be able to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, to speak for those places, those trees, those rivers and streams, the oceans that have shaped our lives. It is a way of saying thank you. And I love the whole concept of coming out of sessions with a deeper sense of gratitude for and our relationships. So, in South Africa, we have a mantra here amongst the African-speaking people, Black African people, called Ubuntu. It's Ubuntu. Ubuntu. It goes a little bit further. It goes Ubuntu. And directly translated, it means because of you, I exist. Now that is profound. Because of you, I exist. Well, you already heard me hint. In fact, it's more than a hint. To go beyond just human to human relationships. Because of this river, I exist. Because of this forest, I exist. It's that deeper sense of what I would call an ecological literacy, of a sense of reciprocity between all living things in our lives. So there you go.
Beautifully said. I think that notion right now is a bit lost, and I'm coming at this from an American perspective. I think right now the role of the individual is at the forefront.
Yes.
In the US, the public health measures are around wear a mask to protect you and not to protect your neighbor.
Correct.
So I want to speak a little bit to what you said 5 years ago on a TEDx stage. And you spoke about humans being psychologically disconnected from our wild origins, isolated, impatient, and a lonely species.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the UK has a minister of loneliness, and I think the US should have one as well. How do we begin to change this perspective? How do we begin to reestablish our identities in connection with others and our natural environment, especially now?
Abby, you're going to have to start living that question.
I am, but I want to create that space for others on this call to maybe hear some of those, your thoughts related to it.
Okay, well, I think first of all, we have to have a fairly good or renewed understanding of what has got us into this position in the first place. Okay? I think the two things, which just amongst many in a very complex situation. You've got the definition of the individual, as I have tried to outline in terms of of an identity, and how this has been badly misrepresented in the Western world particularly, but in the last 40, 50 years. And then, no, let me just stay with that. Let me just stay with that individual. What has happened is individuality has become confused with individualism. Okay? Individuality has become confused with individualism. Then individualism is this is me. I do what I want. That I'm all right, Jack. That I'm on my own. I do what I have to do. You do your thing, I do mine. Crap. All right. That is not individuality. And it's very interesting. Is that the moment you have an ISM, an ism, put behind any word, that movement, that whatever it is dead. It becomes concretized. So here we are in a situation right now, just for a moment, looking at what's happening in the United States of America, as you get this distinction between the left and the right wings in politics, and how the left side of it, the Democratic side of it, just for the moment, are being accused of becoming socialist, and where socialist and socialism comes together. For heaven's sake, don't confuse a social conscience with socialism. Those are two very, very different things. A social conscience has everything to do with human values, social values that are important to each one of us as individuals. The moment you have socialism, then you've got to have government control to make sure that you are that way. And I wouldn't like to live like that. Okay? So this is why I respect enormously, and I say this without apologies, that I love the individual. I'm a one-on-one human being. I don't want to be I'm not easily drawn to groups. I'm very wary of any of reference to those people, the thems and the theys. Why? Because I'm also one of those thems and theys in somebody else's eyes. Because I would like to be treated as an individual on an individual basis. I would like to know that the respect that I gain from other individuals is respect that I deserve or have earned, not just because I'm an older person or because I'm a stranger. No, not at all. So you hear where we're going with this. And so that is the one side of your question is around the individual. The second side of the question is what? What is your question? The third, what you add to that?
Yeah, I think you covered both pieces of it. Just how do we how do we navigate this feeling of isolation that's set in on
All
so
right.
many people and
That's
reconnect
right.
to pieces of our identity?
Okay. Well, you see, that, and thank you for giving me the nudge there. It's quite an irony when you think about it, that we have never ever been as connected worldwide as we are now through social media. We have never been this connected, and yet we are becoming increasingly lonely. What on earth does that tell us? I just think we have to be very careful of the power of virtual reality. Now, let's be clear. Here we are having a Zoom session. This is a virtual session. I'm saying hello to Abby, who I presume exists, and to Barry, and so on. This is not first prize. It's a pretty good substitute. It's allowing us to touch in on things which are on each other, to share our stories, our insights, our fears, our emotions, our experiences in ways that we otherwise couldn't. But my word, it is certainly not first prize. I'll give you a wilderness example. You can, every day, you can go on a safari game drive in South Africa, in certain lodges. It's all virtual. And you'll see the leopards, and you'll see the elephants and lions. But did you really see them? Did you get the smell of that place? Have we forgotten the senses? And so this is something which we need to look at. Do not confuse the virtual reality with the real thing. And sometimes it can be extremely tempting. When you put on those goggles and you go into outer space, when you can, up to a point, I would love to do this, by the way, to experience this, is to put on those goggles and know what it's like to take off in a space rocket and head off into outer space. Can you just imagine that? And to look at this Earth from hundreds of kilometers away and look down at this little fragile blue planet. I would love to be able to do that. It's never going to happen to me in reality. There's a damn good chance I'll be able to see it through the virtual screen, but it is second prize. There's no way I can say, yes, I've been there, or I know that I don't. I can't do that. So let's not forget the real world. Let's not forget the world that is brought to us through all of our senses, and particularly through smell, through sounds, through not only through sounds that we're hearing now, but through the background noises, the birds that are talking. And by the way, in terms of an ecological literacy, we live in a field of information. Bird calls, insect calls are informing us all the time of what is actually happening. And you are not going to hear them if you've got these confounded things on your ears while you're going for a walk in the park. All right. Please just take them off and listen. Well, easier said than done. It's a challenge. Here we are, Abby.
Yes, it is a challenge, especially because so many of us are relying on these means to create or maintain some form of connection. Yeah, I think another piece of your essay that I've been grappling with, as a very privileged cisgendered woman, how do we begin to unpack or address the vast inequalities that are facing, people of color or marginalized populations in this current predicament? How do you think we can think about this inequality, both through a psychological perspective and through an ecological perspective? And maybe those are intertwined.
Well, they are intertwined. Again, there is no quick answer to this. We know that in terms of the biblical saying, there's always been poor people. There will always be poor people, but they don't have to necessarily be poor in a sense that they are desperate. Okay. And I think if there's any way, I'm only going to make one suggestion, is that let's go to that, for me, probably one of the most shattering, essential images of the 20th century was taken on December the 24th, 1968, by William Anders, in the Apollo 11 craft, taking a picture of the Earth rising above the moon. It was a magnificent perspective. He took it almost by accident. They weren't looking for that. They were looking for a safe place for the Apollo 13 astronauts to land the following year. But out is this picture, and that is it. And that is a place called home. It's the only place we've got. You cannot see political boundaries from out there. Okay? If we could just have that, always, as much as possible, we could always have that within our consciousness. It'll go one hell of a lot further to recognize that we are brothers and sisters on this little planet, actually. That we are here to help each other. And you know, this is where we need to pay attention to the poets, some of the great writers of our time, let alone some of the philanthropists and many people who are doing some of the good social work which they are doing. But it's in everybody's interests. It's in everybody's interest that individuals, the basic needs of human beings are actually taken care of. And if we could just do this now, if we just have a consciousness that we are all in this together, it could go one hell of a long way. And this, by the way, could be one of the great lessons from the COVID-19 shutdown of 2020. All right. It is a statement that whether we like it or not, we are in this together. People will have different attitudes, they will have different levels of patience and tolerance as to how they want to handle it. But at the end of the day, every single one of us was affected. Think about this. For those of us who have been through this, for the rest of our lives, you could go anywhere in the world, and meet somebody you've never ever met, and you could ask them a question, where were you in 2020? What did you do? What is it like for you? It would be people, strangers, sharing an experience, sharing emotions, sharing frustrations. This is what it's about, really. Ah, my word. The them, the they, this is part of regressive behavior. The in-groups, the out-groups, and we're seeing this. This has been alive and well, by the way, in not just in American politics. It's been in politics worldwide. But in terms of, and I'm going to come back again to the question, but in terms of dealing with this incredible divide between the haves and the have-nots, it is something which we're going to have to wake up to as being counterproductive for everyone. And you know what? We do have examples. We do have examples in the last century. And one of them, by the way, was the Marshall Plan, which happened at the end of the Second World War. And it was an American initiative. And this is one of the initiatives, by the way, that has accounted for the fact that America for so long has been regarded as such a great country. You know, and I don't want to go too far down this particular road because a lot of that reputation has actually been badly dented, as you know. But that Marshall Plan was a recognition that there are countries in the world following the Second World War who will never be able to repay the debt that they owe. And they wrote those debts off just to give the new generation a chance to start again. We need to look at it that way, economically in the world. You know, the disparity between the haves and the have-nots is sometimes absolutely obscene. We had one incident over here, for example, in South Africa, where the CEO of a platinum mine, the CEO earned in 1 month what it would take the average miner 40 years to earn. Now tell me, I don't care how well qualified you are. There's something not right there. But this is not just confined to South Africa. We're seeing this all over the world. It is part of a primal factor in the human makeup. And this is where, if we had the time, probably not this evening, that we have to understand what the meaning of regression is and what we regress to as human beings when we are under threat, when we go into our cocoons, we become reptilian. We go right back to early brainstem behavior. brainstem survival strategies. I want it all and I want it now. In territorial, well, that is another avenue.
Thank you.
Okay.
Actually, that before I hand it over to the audience to ask a few pointed questions, I'm going to take one quickly from Tamsin on how do we overcome the tendency for people and communities or nations to regress under threat? So the reptilian brain, how do we keep that in check and how do we overcome it? So how do we, the paradox of regression is we continue to use old frameworks to guide our actions moving forward. How do we overcome these regressive behaviors?
Well, I think first of all, you have to be aware of it. You have to be aware that you are regressing. All right. And in order to become aware of it, you need to have at least to have a language or an image of what this really means. And what I will just spend a couple of minutes on here will be something which I find quite useful. We're at any one time as human beings, we are a biological species, we are a social species, and we are a psychological species. At any one time, all right. Our whole history is made up of that particular sequence of events. We must never forget the biological underpinnings of what it means to be a human being. And once again, I want to be clear about something here. To be aware of your biological underpinnings has got nothing to do with biological determinism. All right. We're that triune species, the biological, social, and psychological species, has been beautifully portrayed as on a neurological basis to a reptilian brainstem species, to a limbic ancient mammalian species, and then to a cortex, to a cortical modern mammalian species. I would link those three particular divisions of the brain, and remember they are interactive, all right, to three different kinds of intelligences. The brainstem has a reactive intelligence, all right. The limbic system, social brain, has a responsive intelligence. The cortical or psychological aspect of human being has a reflective intelligence. Now, the most powerful intelligence of all is the brainstem one. It is ancient. It's been around one hell of a long time. And as I said a little earlier, the brainstem wants it all and it wants it now. Okay. It has no interest or no truck with democracy. All right. It cannot handle criticism. It's either flight or fight. All right. It is all sexual display, dominance, everything there. The brainstem is amoral. Amoral. Now, they wanted you politicians who are brainstem politicians, by the way, and I'm not going to name them. They're amoral. Mm-hmm. There is no right or wrong. The evolutionary step from the reptilian to the social species is significant. Why? Because that step is based on one important concept. It is the concept of fair play. It's responsive, the intelligence here. You need to be fair with each other. And you need to be able to know that, wait a minute, if I do this, somebody else is going to do the same back to me. The beginnings of cooperation are the beginnings of social existence. And if we want to survive as a social species, we're going to have to learn how to cooperate in a way that we haven't done before. Okay. So remember, now here comes the regression from the social species. The regression will be to the reptilian base, territorial, me, my group. Okay. And it comes from the whole notion of kinship recognition, by the way. Kinship recognition in a social species is vital. And we see it. It is defined by language groups. It's defined by various cultures. It's defined by belief systems. We all have our little in-groups. And but as a sportsman, for example, I have my in-group. It is the team that I support versus the team that has others. But for heaven's sake, They're always going to be in groups and out groups. Don't turn the out group into an enemy. That is regressive. As soon as the out group becomes the enemy, you know you're moving along the line towards back into reptilian brainstem thinking. And then, of course, comes the next level, the cortical, and then I'm going to hand over
Yes.
to the audience.
Yeah.
This is the reflective intelligence. This is much, much slower than the responsive intelligence, and it is a hell of a lot slower than the reactive. The reflective intelligence, which is a capability, an awareness to be aware of the awareness of others, to be able to see things from multiple perspectives, to take your time and ask questions like, where is this all actually leading? This is maybe a way, a statement, and by the way, this could be some kind of consolation for us as a species right now, that we've got a long way to go. We've got one hell of a long way to go. We are still largely pulled by brainstem regressive urges. It is difficult for us to cooperate. And how are we going to be functioning, cooperating with them in ways that we want to, in a state of increasing loneliness? That goes against the grain of what it means to be a truly social species. So we've got a lot to look at here. And then, of course, we've got the importance of the capacity to reflect, to be able to reflect in a way that's mature, that is fertile, that's meaningful, in a way that we can actually allow ourselves to keep calm enough to say, keep going, guys, just keep doing the right thing. And hopefully, by the way, that reactive intelligence is important here. Don't you sit on a hot plate. You sit on a hot plate, you're not going to think about it before you get off. You're going to say, I wonder who left this plate on. You jump. Thank heavens you can react. It's critical. It's vital that we learn to be able to respond to each other's needs, delayed gratification, all of those. And it is equally important that we have a capacity to reflect, to be able to show that you do see sides of the stories and a reflection that allows you to examine yourself. Hopefully, this can come together in what I would like to call maybe an ecological intelligence. We see how it all is part of a necessary network. It's only and to see ourselves as participants in this wider network and field of what it means to be a human species, biological, social, and psychological, any one time.
Thank you. And now I'd love to turn it over to the audience. If you'd like to write your question in the chat, I welcome it. Or if you'd like to ask it directly, maybe I'm looking at your tiles. If you want to raise your hand, that would be wonderful as well. Let's see, am I missing any hands?
Can I just mention, I have a notice here saying your speaker is not working. Please check your connection or use a different speaker. Is that happening to others?
It's definitely getting a little bit hoarse. So if you can, I think it's better when you don't, try not to turn your head so that the microphone doesn't get moved.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do.
You sound good now to me.
Okay, so I just need to keep still here. Okay.
Yeah, yes.
I'll try not to move from this position.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, are there any, let me see if any questions are coming in. In the meantime, let me ask you. So long ago, you spoke about reflective intelligence as becoming cancerous. Do you see it having gotten, sorry, let me ask a different question. I think that this one, years ago, you wrote Ecological Intelligence.
Yeah.
How do you think your thoughts on ecological intelligence have evolved? And can you give us one practical way in which we can, put that notion to use today, whether it's taking a walk outside or learning about a new tree or engaging with nature a little bit differently than we did before?
Okay, well, I wrote Ecological Intelligence in 2005. And Since then, I've been trying to write some kind of a sequel to the book. And I have to tell you that anything I write now, every time I write it, I look at it and I say, but my God, I've written this before. I seem to be rewriting ecological intelligence over and over again. So it's one thing to be able to write what I feel as I did at that time. It's another thing to put it into a different language and try and say the same thing. And I don't want to do that. That's what I don't want to do. But I think it is any kind of evolving for me. I'll speak personally around this. Is that what has happened since 2005 in terms of my sensing of the meaning of an ecological literacy? And by the way, I touched on this in reference to the biological, social, and psychological species. The intelligences, the reactive, responsive, reflective, and then an ecological intelligence. There is something which goes with ecological intelligence, and which is, by the way, mutually inclusive. It's ecological literacy. It's being able to read and write the signs of the times. It's being able to get to know animals, insects, trees, and I'm talking about this on a very, very practical level. It is to develop what has happened to me in the last 10 years, an interest in the art of tracking. 10 years ago, a friend of mine, Alex van den Heerver, and I started the Tracker Academy in South Africa, teaching young men how to track wild animals. And what you discover here is that the way that you learn to track an animal and the way that you do this is how you keep track of your own life. These become life skills. And the beauty of all of this, of course, is that through the learning art of tracking, you're becoming increasingly literate ecologically. You're understanding the link of these animal tracks, these spurs, to the local vegetation, to a far greater field. It is a new way of seeing things. For example, you will look at the track of an animal. You will look at it, you look into it, you look through it. Ways of seeing. In other words, this is what the animal is, this is what it is doing, this is what it represents. And you could do this for absolutely anything in your own garden. Look at a tree. Just go outside and look at a tree in your garden. Look at it for what it is. You don't have to name it, by the way. You don't have to know its Latin name. I would suggest you give it a name. It makes it a lot more personal. Number two, look into it. Look into the leaves, onto the trees, onto the branches. You might see birds. You might see lichen growing on the branches. You might see insects. It could be a number of things. You'd get a sense of the way the wind is blowing by the way that the leaves are moving. And then you look through it to the tree, or in a much bigger sense of an ecological perspective, of how it belongs here, how it has evolved to establish itself in your garden in this particular territory. So this is what ecological literacy is ultimately about. It is you think about education. There's the famous 3 R's of education. One is reading, the second R is writing, and of course the third R is arithmetic. All right? So forget about the spelling. Reading, writing, arithmetic. Those are the 3 R's. I'll add the 4th, relationships. You get those 4 together, reading, writing, arithmetic, and relationships, and you are now on the road with becoming ecologically literate with respect to what's happening in and around you.
Thank you. And I have a couple of audience questions I'm excited to ask. So from Mike, by 2100, according to some urbanists, the 3 most populous cities in the world will be in Africa. How will Ubuntu look in our sprawling mega cities?
Okay, look, what we're dealing with now is the age, is not just an age-old question. It is the question of our time. It is the whole situation, the reality of, of a growing population. What are we sitting with at the moment? We're sitting with something like 7 billion people. We will perhaps a fraction over that. We've gone up 1 billion people since 2005. That is exponential. And the important thing here is that this is unprecedented. There's nowhere in history where we can say, oh, well, this has happened before, and this is what we did to deal with this situation. The big question is, are we going to be able to stop it? Well, I haven't got a clue whether we're going to be able to stop it. Can we slow it down? We might as well say, well, hopefully. Well, this adds to something which is more important than anything else. What we're going to need to do is that we're going to need to move away from being put off, or what is something, there's another word I'm looking for here. Let's not be too bogged down by numbers. The most important thing here is behavior. In other words, you could have 2,000 people in a village behaving badly. You can have 2 million people in a city where 20 people behave badly. The city is a better example. So let's get away from numbers. It's how we're going to behave, how we're going to be treating each other. To me, that's going to be the only way to come to terms with what it means to live in a world where the population is increasing. And you know, hardly am I speaking like this when I realize I'm in uncharted waters, and in fact we all are. We talk sometimes very glibly of nature will have its way, that one day there'll be an asteroid from outer space which will wipe us out, and that'll be it. And this is typical of nature. Well, look what's happening now. We've got a virus, which, by the way, is a fascinating virus in its own way. And what we're discovering, just for what it's worth, so this is a highly contagious virus, but it's not highly lethal. There are other viruses which have been a lot more lethal than COVID-19. But the point I'm trying to make here is that in terms of nature having its way, it probably really will. And we brace ourselves for the possibility that before the year 2100, there would have been some kind of way that nature has reduced the human population. Well, I don't want to go down that road, you know, apart from the fact that I'm not going to be alive then. I just come straight back to you guys. Let's not get too caught up on those kind of statistics. Let's just rather stay with understanding what we need to do right now, little by little. These are unprecedented times, unprecedented statistics in terms of human beings. Let's move away from being hung up by the numbers.
Thank you. Let me dive into another audience question from Brunit. You mentioned biological, psychological, and social dimensions. What about the spiritual dimension? How does this dimension come into play?
I would put that question right back to you. I'll answer it my own way, but I think it's a very important question for you to answer personally. Where does the spiritual dimension begin and end? And I would like to see this as embedded within an ecological consciousness. You know, we are a biological, social, psychological species, yes, but we also have that phenomenon called the spirit, which is immeasurable. No one can define it. You cannot pin it down. It is a beautiful word in its own way. And we also have another one, which is very similar to that one. It's called soul. Where does soul feature in our lives, in our makeup? Well, I would suggest that soul is everywhere. Soul is in the brainstem, by the way, in its own way. It's in our socialization. It's in our individuality. We struggle for words, as I mentioned a little earlier. We need a language that will better able us to define who we are and where we're going. And so these words, I warm to them, by the way. I warm to the sense of spirit and soul in the human psyche. It refuses to be tied down. It is anti-gravity. It's not going to, you cannot put spirit or soul in a box, but you know when it is there, and you also know when it is not there. That I know, that I'm very aware of. And by the way, there's some beautiful poetic ways of looking at this whole phenomenon of spirit and soul. I think of Federico Lorca's understanding of the Spanish word duende. Barbara Fairhead, I know that you understand duende as that mysterious power that just simply cannot be measured, that comes from the soles of your feet, that pricks you like a bloody rusty nail, that you know, that when you speak, you know the person's got duende when he speaks as if a scab has just been pulled off the back of his skin, the back of an arm or a leg, that hurts. You know this is authentic, you know it is real. So spirit is there. And I'm repeating myself here. It is.
Let me jump in. Let me jump in with another question from Jordy. What is your notion of nature and our embeddedness in it versus a commodified notion of nature? She's asking about it in practice, and how do we in practice reconnect with the natural world? And I think you spoke a bit to this earlier, how we look into it, through it, and represents, and how it represents. But is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Okay. Now this what I'm saying now is quite sensitive in a way, but I'm going to share this with you because I get asked this question quite often. Where is God in all of this? Okay. And my question, my answer to that is, in a way, the question is absurd. It's an absurd question. Could you imagine, just think for the moment, just stay with a moment, of substituting the word God, substituting the word nature with a capital N for God. Right? So if somebody says to me, do you believe in God? I might as well say, do you believe in nature? With a capital N. How do you, you're in nature. You're part of it. You're an expression of it. You and I are living museums of the entire history of life on this planet. So, this is what's important to me in terms of a greater understanding of what it means to develop a sense of connection with nature. Let's stay with that, the line or what I've just said right now. Think about it. What is it like to know that you are a living museum of the entire history of life on this planet? That your DNA and the DNA of a fruit fly, for heaven's sake, is intertwined. That we are linked by a biological language of DNA to every single living thing. This is nature. We come from the stars, for God's sakes. The very first element that was formed 13.7 billion years ago was hydrogen. Hydrogen. There's never been a single hydrogen atom formed or destroyed in 13.7 billion years. You and my body is made up of something like 80% plus of water, 2 hydrogen molecules, and 2 hydrogen atoms, and 1 oxygen atom. Those hydrogen atoms are 13.7 billion years old, for heaven's sakes. How far back do you want to go? And then comes helium. And then comes the psychiatrist's dream. The third element formed is lithium. They had to have something to calm down this sort of cosmic manic episode, you know, and so it goes. So how do we realign ourselves with nature? Well, we realign ourselves with nature by realizing that we cannot escape it. We're in it. It is with us. We are with it. We are living expressions of it. And by the way, we are the human expression of nature. So strictly speaking, and I kind of warm to this notion, that strictly speaking, there is no human nature. There's only nature and the very human expression of it. The way that a tree will express its nature, the way that my cat will express his nature, the way that I will express mine, the way we express ours.
Mm-hmm.
We are part of that. And with one possible difference, is that we are conscious of what we are doing when we are doing it from time to time. So nature, it is absurd to ask the question is about connecting, how to reconnect with nature is an absurd question. You can't escape it. You've been part of it whether you like it or not.
Thank you. And I'm going to take a question from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Lilitha. How do we prepare for the unknown? And how do we begin asking people to change their lives and lifestyle, knowing the outcome will only be seen years later? So we're returning to the behavior question.
Right. I think that two very short answers to that question. The first one, how do we prepare for the unknown? I haven't got a clue. That's the first answer. Okay. And I mean that. The second is going to be linked to the first answer. And that is, you change. Don't worry about trying to change anyone else. You change. And see what happens. You do what you do, and you do what you do wholeheartedly. And you do what you do for the sake of others, as well as for yourself, and see what happens.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful note that I'm going to hand it over to Tamsin to tell us about some upcoming events and to provide some thank yous. And then I know, Ian, you'll be wrapping us up with a poem. But I wanted to say thank you so much for taking this time. And as we all grapple with our existence and identity and how we show up in the world and how we change our behaviors to adapt to a new reality, thank you for being a guiding voice in this crisis. So Tamsin, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Abby. And just before I do that, I'm going to ask you, Ian, just a question back to your response to Geordie in terms of the nature, human or man versus nature. Because I do remember even before you wrote Ecological Intelligence, and so this is clearly in the 90s, you and Ian Player gave a speech that I attended, which I think was transformative for me, where you mentioned that if you consider the evolution of the Earth over time, and you considered man as an evolutionary growth.
Oh, she's here now. I will let her ask the question.
Welcome back, Tamsin.
Welcome back, Tamsin.
Tamsin, you're on mute.
Tamsin, I asked the question, but it'd be great if you could ask it again about how we use the word unprecedented.
Okay, that wasn't my question. My question was, sorry.
Okay, please take on a new question. Okay.
My question was about your comment about man having been, or having really been the evolution of nature's reflective capacity. And at this conversation with you and Ian Player, you specifically stated that the problem had been that man had become cancerous on the body of which she was dependent. And so I think going back to Geordie's connection about that reconnection, in fact, I think part of her question is nature has become foreign to us. And so the question, as I understand part of it, which is part of my own question, is how do we remove that cancerousness? And maybe it's that reptilian brain, so maybe this is all connected. But it has always stuck in my head as the question of what can I do, what can any of us do to remove the cancerousness, and whether you still see it that way at all.
Well, Tamsin, thank you for that. I think, first of all, we're using the word cancer here, I think also in the same light as we would refer to a growth. We look at the whole concept of human development, of progress, of economic growth, forgetting that this is also, in terms of the language, also implies always a dark side. It always comes with a shadow, you know. And if one looks at human consumptive behavior almost like a parasite, it's very, very difficult to escape the analogy of the meaning of a cancer, which is really, it is a cell that belongs to the body, which has become autonomous. It no longer has, for want of a better way of describing it, has no respect for the rest of the system that makes up the entire being. And it's in this autonomous behavior where the shift has gone from being individualistic to individualism, that we start behaving in a way that a cancer behaves. And that is really so if we could just look at it in that particular light, then we're able to, again, I'll come right back to what I mentioned earlier, begin to see that there's that each of us as individuals need to do something little by little in our own way. I can't for the life of me come up with any formula that will say this is what we all need to do right now. What I will do is I will say, listen, be careful of two things. One, be careful of confusing optimism with hope, okay? And the second will be very careful of self-righteousness. Be careful of falling into the trap of self-righteousness, which is very often exactly what happens to us as activists. We forget how to listen. We think that our way of doing things is the only way. Watch out. We need to learn how to listen very, very carefully to what's going on in and around us all the time, little by little. I'll come back to the Tracking Academy and the tracking of a wild animal. You don't just go and track the animal. You take your time. You listen. You wait for the right times, and you go about it that way. So to come to the first part, the optimism and hope, I think it's vital that we understand this, that we dare not be optimistic in a way that says, don't worry, everything is going to be all right, because we don't know. But hope is something different. Hope is what that old Czechoslovakian first president of Klabaval, he said hope is a deep sense of that certain things carry meaning. And this is what's important. Certain things carry meaning, and that meaning has got to do with your own values. Your values as a human being, and your values, if you like, as how I like to see it these days, to become hunter-gatherers of values. Each of us in our own way. We need to be hunter-gatherers again, not with loincloths and bows and arrows and going back to a state where there's no running water. My God, that's a harsh life. But hunter-gatherers of values, and those are the values of wildness to me. The values of unpretentiousness, of patience, the values of freedom, the values of some sense of free will, of a will that allows you to move where you need to move. These are the values we need to look at, the values for the sheer existence of other species, to validate their existence in a much, much broader field of ecological thinking. Become hunter-gatherers of values.
Thank you. So I have to thank both of you and Abby, for a wonderful conversation, and Ian again for sharing with us. I know that from the comments that I've been getting, people have found it so resonant, and I think certainly the thread of hope, the four of us who have been sort of instigating this, Jerry, Tom, Barry, and myself, hope has definitely been one of the threads that is coming through. And in fact, two things that you've spoken about: hope a regression and the struggle in the face of frustration and regression to keep that hope is going to be the subject of a conversation in 2 weeks' time. So you will all be invited, and if you're on this list, you will definitely be invited to that. But I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. I would most especially like to thank Barbara Fairhead, who instigated this conversation by sharing in your piece in Thrive Global. And I'd really like to thank Abby for stepping into the role of conversationalist and giving us this intergenerational perspective as well. So thank you all very much. The recording will be sent out with a note. And Ian, I'm going to hand over to you for a fierce ending.
Thank you. Right. I want to say thank you, Tamsin. And thank you, Abby. And Barry, and thank you for the audience for being patient enough to share this time. I would like to end off with 2 poems. Once again, is because poetry finds its way into the psyche like no other language. And the first poem I want to share with you is written by one of my favorite human beings. Her name is Barbara Fairhead. And I'd like you to know that everything which I have been speaking about today is a reflection on a poem that she once wrote called Requiem for a Broken World. It's one of the most lovely poems. And here it is. This is a song of loss and betrayal, of broken things and endings. This is a song of ancestral memories, of ancient covenants and forgetting. There is a rage in me and a sorrow and a song of grief, so deep and full, my soul suffers the singing. There is a wound in me that shall not heal, the deep wound of the kingdom, the wound of your kind. There's a wound in me. There is the duende. That is that immeasurable wound that drives us, that heals us. And Barbara, thank you for that. This is a song of loss and betrayal. This is a requiem for a broken world. And if we are going to become hunter-gatherers of values, let's do so. Each one of us in our own way. And let's do it fiercely. And so I will end with a poem, Fierce. I like the word fierce, the way it aligns itself with nakedness and solitude. A fierce nakedness, a fierce solitude. And I like the way it holds the word fire. I like that word fire. The way it ignites the cutting edge of poetry, refusing to be nothing less than a fiery edge, a fiery tongue. And I like the way it nurtures the word wild. I like the word wild. The way it weaves its way between yes and no, you're refusing to be nothing less than a wild anger, wild joy. And I like the way it feeds the word fierce. I like that word, fierce. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Look forward to seeing you all again, everyone.